So we will start with a brief overview of the symphony, and it will be much briefer than the one of the concerto, because we did cover a number of things already in regards to Rachmaninoff's style. What is interesting is that the symphony as such, just like the concerto, has a very, very long history. It has been around for hundreds of years. There are thousands of works written in the genre. I mean, Joseph Haydn alone wrote 104 symphonies. So we're dealing with a very, very large body of works. And in a sense, this has a lineage. I mean, some composers, some contemporary composers may say, oh yes, but what I do is not based in any way on the Romantic Symphony or on the Classical Symphony. Which it may not be. It may be using completely different techniques, compositional techniques, completely different use of harmony, completely different structure, but that in itself is a reaction to the works that came before. So in a sense, that is a continuation of that same tradition in a slightly different mask. And what we've discussed before with the concerto is that if you break things down, we have the same musical elements in these works. We have rhythm that we can look at. We can look at orchestration. We can look at melody. We can look at harmony. We can look at different textures that the composer dresses these ideas in, whether they are monophonic, homophonic, polyphonic. So we have a number of things that are there that we can discuss. Okay, so let's start our journey. The term symphony first appears in the 16th century. The word itself means a concord of sound, so something that sounds nice together. And the first works, which are called sinfonias, appear in Giovanni Gabrieli's Sinfonia Sacra, 1597, again St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. Just like the concerto, they were sacred works with singers, soloists, choir, and instrumental accompanists. Later on, this developed into the opera sinfonia, which was basically used as an introduction to operas. That's the Italian overture. Again, fast, slow, fast sections. This idea of contrast, I think, permeates all of our Western musical canon. Things are built on contrast. That is either contrast between the sections. That could be contrast on horizontal planes, so between melody and accompaniment. That could be contrast in vertical planes between different sections of the orchestra. So I think contrast is essential to our listening also. And the ability to hear contrast in all these sections. There is a wonderful quote by Igor Stravinsky, where he says, it is important to listen, and listening is a skill, because a duck, like the animal, a duck can hear also. He spoke with this inimitable, very thick Russian accent and slightly Frenchified grammar. So hearing a work and listening to it, that is processing it, are two entirely different things. Music, as we take it in the Western tradition, has meaning. So it's not just a bunch of notes which are laid upon each other and sound nice together. The great artworks, the great masterworks of the Western canon are works which have certain meanings, and they can be interpreted. So, moving on. The opera sinfonia that we discussed, that was basically an overture, is considered the direct forerunner of the orchestral symphony that we know today. These sinfonias in the Baroque period appeared to Handel operas and oratorios. They appear in Bach's cantatas. A number of them begin with an introductory movement, especially the grander ones for the feast days of the Lutheran Church. And again, through Bach's sons, and again, most notably through J.C., Johann Christian Bach, The symphony moves into the classical period. Just like with the instrumental concerto, the big difference is form. In the classical period, the first movement of the symphony acquires sonata form. It is molded in the sonata form. So exposition, development, and recapitulation with two or more contrasting subjects. Composers like Mozart liked to introduce more subjects than were necessary. For this, I always like to think of the Mozart F major sonata, K332. I mean, when we're talking about a symphony, we're essentially talking about a sonata scored for orchestra. But some Mozart sonatas have up to 6 subjects that he juggles around with. The K332 is a famous example. F major, the first movement. The wealth of material is incredible. In the classical period, the symphony was used in the entr'acte for operas, so in between acts of operas. The symphony was also used as background or entertainment music in the salons of the aristocracy. Mozart divertimenti. It's the way we listen to a work where we are completely silent. Our tradition comes from the Romantic period. In the times of Mozart, people would talk during a symphony. They might stop to hear a particular passage or a particular singer who was playing in an opera, but essentially it was what we have in jazz today. People would applaud after a solo, for example. It was much freer. Another use for the symphony was even as part of church services, which is quite remarkable. There was no standard orchestration for a symphony during the classical period. Some of the symphonies that survive only have a string orchestra, so 4 parts, 2 violins, viola, and cello. However, the size of the musical ensemble at a particular court was a matter of prestige to the court. So wealthy courts like that of the Esterházy family, very, very wealthy, they're the ones that employed Haydn, had more instrumentalists, more people per part of music, so not just 2 violins, but say 4 people playing the first violin, 4 people playing the second violin. They also had other instruments like horns, flutes, timpanis, bassoons, trumpets. And these large ensembles facilitated the expansion of the symphony. So a composer would take orchestral color as something to play around with. They would take contrasts between these different instrumental groups and thus expand the form. The symphony became longer. If you look at Mozart's first symphony, composed when he was, I believe, 10 or 11 in London, under the influence of J.C. Bach, the whole thing is over in 9 minutes. If you look at his Jupiter Symphony, number 41, composed in the year of his death, or the year before he died, sorry, that is almost 35 minutes. If you look at Beethoven's Eroica, it is almost 50 minutes. So the symphony expands. Rachmaninoff's second symphony, not the one we're looking at today, is 70 minutes, just like most symphonies of Mahler. The first 4 movement symphonies appear towards the end of the classical period, and that was a result of an introduction of a minuet or scherzo between the slow and the final movement. In the Romantic period, the symphony became much more significant. That was basically single-handedly the work of Beethoven. He imbued the symphony with a significance. He did not see it as purely a party piece. He felt it had the potential to communicate a deeper meaning. We speak in Beethoven's symphonies of the victory through struggle narrative. That is a term, I believe, coined by Richard Taruskin, the musicologist. If you think of the Fifth Symphony, we all know what that sounds like, hopefully. Who does not know the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven? Who can't recall it? The famous C minor. That is an example of victory through struggle. There is a lot that happens in the symphony, but Beethoven emerges in triumph. The symphony ends in major. And that was taken in the Romantic period as as symbolic of the struggle of Beethoven himself, his struggle with deafness, overcoming deafness, and continuing to compose. It also meant a lot to the rising middle classes, again, a sociological thing. People identified themselves with the hero of the symphony, the hero of the narrative, rather. Beethoven also changed the way symphonies were written. Symphonies in the classical era were produced in large quantities. For example, J. Seebach wrote them in sets of 6. So his Opus 1 is a set of 6 symphonies, right? Whereas for Beethoven, a symphony was an individual thing, and all of his works are completely different. I mean, if you think about Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, going on to No. 5, the famous C minor, No. 6, the Pastoral, the 9th Symphony with the famous 4 vocalists as soloists and the choir, a full choir. So that was a unique thing. And his way of writing symphonies influenced all other composers that came after him, like Brahms, like Mahler. The symphony was the coming of age of a composer. In fact, Brahms delayed producing his first symphony until he was really, really confident and secure of himself. And when it came out, people nicknamed it Beethoven's 10th, because it really continued that tradition of Beethoven's symphonic writing. An interesting development in the Romantic Symphony, we discussed the beginnings of the concert series and the first concert halls that were built in the early Romantic period. We also have the first professional orchestras as independent institutions, not under a court or a church. And that happens in the Romantic period as well. So, moving on to Rachmaninoff's 3rd Symphony. Rachmaninoff's first symphony was a big flop. He was incredibly, he was crucified by the press for that. The main critic was César Cui, another Russian composer, whose review was so negative of Rachmaninoff's first symphony that Rachmaninoff didn't compose anything for 2 years after that. Which is why Rachmaninoff was continually very sensitive to criticism after that. He emerged from this creative crisis with the 2nd piano concerto, which was a triumphant success. The 2nd symphony, produced in 1908, was a great success as well. The 3rd is a completely different work. It is much shorter. It only has 3 movements, as opposed to the 4 in his 1st and 2nd symphony. A typical performance goes for 40 minutes. Again, it's, in a sense, a little bit anti-romantic. It's a step backwards. The innovation that he introduced in this symphony is that the 2nd movement, the slow movement, actually incorporates a scherzo in the work itself. So it's like 2 movements in one. It has a cyclic form. I mean, it has obviously the sonata form as a base for the first movement. Rachmaninoff was a great traditionalist. However, he does use motto themes throughout the work, which unifies the work, and he uses the Dies Irae plain chant. Who knows what that is? Mozart used it as well. It's a plain chant from the Middle Ages. It was used by a number of composers. Rachmaninoff was one of the ones that used it the most. He used it in many works, in the Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini, for example. It appears in his 2nd sonata. He was fascinated by that. It appears in the Rock, the symphonic poem. So there is a lot of thematic material to be analyzed there, which you will probably do when you are working on that piece next year. It is considered the most expressively Russian symphony. There are a lot of dance rhythms in the finale. But what really sets it apart is the economy of thematic material and the compact structure. This is the full orchestration of the work. In this symphony, he uses quite a lot of orchestral effects, and we'll hear some of them. For example, it opens with a very, very unusual combination of instruments. A solo clarinet, a solo cello, con sordino, it is marked, and a muted horn. Let's hear that. The first subject comes in after this introduction. A very eerie way to start a piece, very unusual. Muted horn, cello con sordino, and a solo clarinet. There are a lot of colors in this work, if you hear them. Percussion is used to great effect in the second movement, in the transition from the adagio to the scherzo. So the scoring needs really a lot of attention in the study of this symphony. Symphony essentially meant an instrumental piece, and it was used as a filler or an entertainment or a background. Beethoven, with the romantic ideals that were happening at the time, the change of zeitgeist, the whole new philosophy of music, as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution, the re-evaluation of the aesthetics of art, what art was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to fulfill a certain function anymore, right? Not as a background or as something. It was supposed to be expressive. That happens overall. It's not just the symphony. Look at Beethoven's piano sonatas. Look at basically anything that Beethoven does. That is explored, if you are interested in pursuing that, in Richard Taruskin's The History of Western Music, the Oxford History set. There are 5 volumes. The 19th century one has a lot of information on that transition. It's a very philosophical topic because you are discussing the meaning of art. What makes a work meaningful? What gives it meaning? Can we possibly interpret meaning into a work that the composer did not intend? For this, there is a great, absolutely great article by a musicologist called Susan McClary, who talks about, say, that was published in the 300th anniversary, the year of the 300th anniversary of Bach's birth, 1985, that was, where she talks about the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5 and the meaning that that work has based on its unorthodox scoring. It's a fascinating article, and that's quoted in the Taruskin history as well. Yeah.